All right, everybody, these are the lab safety rules and the instructions for the IC lab. First lab safety rule is that there should be no food or drink at the lab stations. We just want to make sure there's no cross-contamination from your hands and the chemicals that we are working with into your food or drink. So please just make sure that there is nothing edible at the lab stations. The second lab safety rule is you want to make sure that the tips of these droppers don't touch anything. So we have these ions in these droppers, and they're gonna come out of the dropper tips. Now you want to make sure that nothing touches those things. So make sure you don't touch it with your hands. You don't wipe with a paper towel. You want to make sure it doesn't make contact with anything. So what you're going to be doing for this lab is you're going to be dropping the ions that are inside of your droppers onto this transparency, and you're basically going to be mixing them, the two ions, the cation and the anion, where the boxes line up. So for example, let's do the first one, Ag plus and OH minus. So we're going to take our silver one and we're going to drop maybe about 2 or 3 drops onto the box. Okay, now a couple things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that your hand is elevated above the transparency, because you don't want the dropper tip to even touch the liquid that you've already dropped. So for example, we've done Ag plus and we're going to be combining that with OH minus. Now we want to make sure that, again, the dropper tips don't touch anything. So when you drop it, keep your hand elevated. You want to keep the dropper tip about 2 inches above the surface of the transparency. Easy way to do that is keep your hand off the transparency. So we're going to drop it onto the transparency, and you want to make sure that your dropper tip does not touch it. Now, if there's a situation where the fluid is not coming out, you do not want to dab it on the drop that's already there, because if you do that, as you noticed, you had 2 pretty clear solutions create this precipitate in there, and if the dropper tip touches what's already there, it's going to contaminate what's inside of these bottles. Now it's very easy for your instructor to tell if the dropper tips have touched the other compounds and got cross-contaminated, and if that happens, you and your group will get an automatic 0 on the lab, because it is very difficult for us to clean out these droppers. If you contaminate them by having the dropper tips touch anything, then we have to throw away the dropper and make a new bottle. And so for the sake of lab safety, but also making sure that you can follow lab procedures correctly, if you do contaminate your droppers, then you will get an automatic 0 and not be able to participate in the next lab. So just make sure the dropper tip especially does not touch the liquid that's already on your transparency. The second common error that we see with students is that you are working with 9 different droppers, and so just make sure you don't take off the caps and leave it out, because if you do that with all 9, then you're not going to know which cap goes onto which dropper. And again, we want to avoid any contamination. So you want to make sure that after you use a dropper, you want to close the cap and keep the caps on the droppers. That way you don't mix up the caps and cause contamination. I know I've said this a couple times, but again, it's very easy for us to tell if you've contaminated the droppers by either touching the solution with the dropper tips or mixing up the caps. It will form a precipitate on the dropper tip, and if that happens, you and your group will get a 0 and you will not be participating in the next lab. So just make sure that you are following those lab safety rules. All right, so in terms of the actual lab procedure, it's pretty simple. I just demonstrated for you. You're going to put about 2 or 3 drops of each ion in the box that it corresponds to, and you're just going to combine it with the cation and anion that lines up in each box. So in this one, we did silver 1 and we did hydroxide. In the box under, we're going to do copper 2 and hydroxide, so on and so forth. And you're going to do that with all 9 of your droppers until you have this entire table filled out. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that the lab data table that you filled out in the previous lab for the pre-lab, it's the exact same table as the one right here, right? It's just kind of turned. So on the top row, we have hydroxide, iodide, phosphate, chloride, and fluoride. Same thing right here. And then the cations are the same as well. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be going on your table, you're going to be filling out the color of each ion. So when they're by themselves, you can just look in the dropper bottle. So for hydroxide, you would find hydroxide right over here, and you would just write down what color you see. Clear is a color that you can write, so if it's clear, write clear. And then once you mix your ions to create the ionic compound on your transparency, you're going to write down what color they form. And so you should see changes for some of them when you form a precipitate. And so if the two colors that you combine might be different than the color that you produce with your ionic compound. That's what you're going to be filling out. First thing you're going to do is you're going to mix your ions to create your ionic compounds, and then after that you are going to write down what color they are. Now, once you've filled out your lab table with the colors, and after you have mixed all your ionic compounds, you're going to call to your instructor and have your instructor come to check your dropper sheet. Do not clean this up before your instructor checks it, because you will get credit for completing this lab. But if you clean it up, you'll have to do it again. And so just make sure you call your instructor before you clean up your lab. Now, once your instructor has checked your transparency, you'll be instructed to fill out your table with the last thing, with the precipitate information, which we'll talk about, which your instructor will give you more information as they check it. All right, for the cleanup, it's very simple. You're just going to ask your instructor for some paper towels, and you're going to be using 4 different paper towels. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to take a dry paper towel and you're going to clean your transparency to absorb any of the solutions that you mix. So you're going to use a dry paper towel to clean up your transparency. And then after that, you're going to get a second paper towel. You're going to wet it in any of the sinks that your instructor has you use, and you're going to use a wet paper towel to wipe down the transparency. And then after that, once you use the wet paper towel, you're going to use another dry paper towel to dry off the water. And then after that, you're going to take one more dry one to make sure all of the liquid is off of the transparency. And then after that, when your transparency is completely dry, you're going to return your transparency and all of the droppers back to where your instructor gave them to you. And then after that, you're going to use the information from your completed lab table in order to complete the post lab on Canvas. All right, now after you have returned the transparency and the 9 dropper bottles to your instructor, everybody in your group is going to go to the sink and wash their hands with water just to make sure that there's no chemicals left over on your hands. And then after that, you're going to use your completed lab table in order to complete the post lab on Canvas. All right, now before we close, let's talk about the purpose of this lab. So the first purpose of the lab is for us to obviously see the ionic compounds that we've been learning about, how different ions can combine to form ionic compounds, and to use the solubility table to see if they form precipitate. But the second thing is actually for the instructor. This lab is pretty chill, not too difficult, not too many things going on, but it's a way for the instructors to see, to gauge the class and see who is able to follow the lab safety rules, who is able to follow lab procedures properly, and it's a way for the instructor to see who can be trusted. Because as we go further into the year, we're going to be using more volatile equipment like Bunsen burners with fire, with acids, more hazardous things. And if you're not able to follow instructions and lab safety rules to work with just ions inside of dropper bottles, then you can't really be trusted to use more dangerous and potentially harmful lab equipment and chemicals. And so this is a way for the instructors to feel out the class, see which students follow directions, follow lab procedures. And so just make sure that you're following all the lab safety rules that you've talked about with your instructor, that you look at all the procedures carefully, and that if you have any questions, make sure you ask your instructor. Especially when it comes to lab safety, there are no dumb questions. You want to make sure that you are safe, that the people around you are safe, and that we're able to conduct these laboratory investigations without anyone getting hurt.